Welcome to Súil, Eile, a different view. I'm Rory Hearn.
I'm Patricia Stevenson.
And we're talking about the big stories, actually in the last couple of weeks. The biggest one, Patricia, the war in Iran, Trump's illegal invasion, which the Irish government still hasn't called out as an actual illegal invasion.
Yeah, it's actually amazing listening to them sort of say things like, oh, well, we want countries to uphold the UN Charter. And then when you ask them, but will you call this an illegal war and will you acknowledge that the US has breached international law? They won't do it. Like, it's just amazing. It's like amazing to watch the spin again. I think we've talked about the ability to spin things in the past of this government, that they can't call a spade a spade. And it's so frustrating, and it's actually just insulting to people's intelligence. Like, I think people at home find it really frustrating to watch that.
It is, and like what the war has done already in terms of, like, you look at how many people have died, thousands died.
Huge amounts of displacement,
Huge amounts of displacement. And Israel unleashing, like, another attack into Lebanon. I think over 1,000 people killed in Lebanon by Israel. Like, again, silence from the Irish government on that.
And it's almost like these numbers have become meaningless to us. Like, we hear 700 people have been killed in Gaza since the ceasefire, 1,000 people killed in Lebanon. The far-right minister, Smotrich, in Israel is just saying, well, we're going to just take this land and we're going to expand the Israeli border into South Lebanon. It is colonialist stuff, and we're just kind of accepting it and saying nothing. Like, it is such a dangerous precedent that we're setting. Do you know, the other thing that happened in Iran, which isn't getting enough attention, was the bombing of the oil refineries. And it is a huge ecological disaster, which is going to have implications, I think, the same amount of CO2 that Iceland emits in a year has been emitted in Iran over the last few weeks.
It's just, it's actually incredible that, again, when we look at this and you see what's going on and you feel so powerless in so many ways. And the one thing we can kind of do is try influence the government and try and get our government to take a position, at least internationally, uphold values of neutrality, of peace. And yet it could be doing more. It could be.
It could be doing more. I think they're really passive. They use a lot of language around human rights. They use a lot of language around international law, but we don't see that practiced in any meaningful way. The Occupied Territories Bill is like a really obvious example of that. Like, the passing of the Occupied Territories Bill is to bring us in line with international law. It's our bare minimum to meet our obligations under international law, and they're not doing that. So they're talking about out of both sides of their mouth. They're using the rhetoric of international law, and they're not putting any of it into practice. And people see through that. I think people really, really see through that. The other major issue, I suppose, with, like, Trump has unleashed hell in the Middle East, but he's also unleashed, like, a lot of challenges for us domestically in Ireland because of the cost of living, the cost of fuel, the cost of petrol.
Yeah, absolutely. People have seen it. The cost of, oil going up, shooting up. And of course, it comes back to, like, I think there's a number of aspects in this. One is the issue that we still have the, ongoing cost of living crisis before this particular war has been unleashed. And the government, the slowness in which they've reacted, and the miserly way in which they've reacted. I described in the Dáil the other night, it was like, it's Scrooge for ordinary people and it's Santa Claus for the investor funds, for developers, for fast food giants. They've given them billions in tax cuts, and they're just kind of saying, we need to be really careful as to what we do. And there was no serious package of measures given.
No.
There was no, it's nothing like we saw.
It's not going to make a dent on what people are actually dealing with. People who are really suffering with the cost of living, it's not going to make a dent for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just actually at a presentation by One Family, the organisation that works support lone parents. And the figures are stark in terms of poverty and deprivation that this particular group we know as well, elderly people, disabled people, who have high rates of deprivation. But almost a half of all lone parents, 46%, live in deprivation. Like, that means they are going without material things like, being able to heat the home, being able to buy a certain amount of food each week. Like, these are, like, really basic things we need. And half of lone parent families are in deprivation, and they're highlighting that, for example, the housing assistance payment rate hasn't increased in years, yet rents have gone up. And we need serious measures in order to try and address this kind of, 320,000 people in arrears. And of course, the government says, we have to be fiscally sustainable here with this, and
whilst reducing our tax base.
Exactly.
By giving tax breaks to developers.
And investor funds. And they also say that, we need to be careful, and yet they've billions in surplus that they're putting into various funds that are doing what, And this actually comes back to something I was thinking about. I'm interested to hear your view. Like, when we look at Spain, people are highlighting Spain. that, they've switched to renewable energy, they've invested, and so they're not facing this crisis. And we've the Irish government, and what have they done?
Well, the Irish government have actually, what they've done in the last few years has made us less sustainable. Yeah. We have the data centres. We have 89 data centres now in Ireland. When Micheál Martin was in the Oval Office, when he was speaking to business leaders in Washington, he said, we're going to have more data centres. Yeah. More data centres.
Guzzling up our
We have
energy.
Currently 20% of our energy usage is going to data centres. Already, we know that in 2030 that's going to be 30%. Compared to our closest EU neighbours, I think the Netherlands, it's like 3% that they spend on data centres. Mm. And what that actually means is data centres are taking energy away from the national grid, and they are pushing up energy prices for ordinary people and ordinary households. That is what our government is prioritising.
And don't they actually pay less?
They pay less, yeah. And we're actually seeing an increase in
households.
And we're seeing an increase in some data centres using more renewables. And that sounds really great. You're like, okay, renewables, brilliant. But what that means is actually our grid is using more fossil fuels. And so ordinary households are paying more for the fossil fuel generated electricity. And it's a scandal. This should be a national scandal. No one's not saying that data centres are not critical infrastructure. Like, they're built into the way we live now. Like, we need that in terms of, how online payments, all of the online world that we work in. But we are engaging them to such an extent that ordinary households are being deprioritised by this government.
And I also think a complete failure to invest in wind energy, in renewable energy, in solar energy, and that's what the Spanish government did and has been doing for years. Here we're kind of privatizing it, similar to what we've done with housing, giving licenses to real estate, to global investor funds to develop our wind. Where is the state-led development of our public, of wind energy that could actually reduce energy costs and significantly, make us basically not dependent on these oil spikes?
The problem is, and you'll agree with me, I think, on this, is ultimately this government doesn't believe in their ability as the managers of the state, because they're not leaders, they are managers of the state to deliver anything.
Well, I think they not only don't believe in their ability, they actually don't want to. No. They don't see the state playing that role. But of course, another area is the whole issue of retrofitting of housing and homes. And the SRI point out the government is nowhere near targets of hitting retrofitting. And of course, that's a key area which you can reduce use of fossil fuels. You can give people warmer homes. Yeah. You can actually increase, solar panel.
The major thing with that whole retrofitting, the retrofitting grants that the government have previously had in place, they seem brilliant. But the fact of the matter is, they only actually help people that have money. Yeah. The people that don't have the money to pay up front don't benefit from them. Yeah. So again, it's who this government is actually choosing to prioritise. They're not. These measures are never targeted. Yeah. And they're not going to the people that need them most, the people that don't have, that can't afford to pay the highest heating bills that they have because they don't have, insulation in their walls. So again, it's just a question of prioritisation.
Absolutely, and thinking long term as well. If we're trying to actually get ourselves into a place of energy security, deal with energy poverty, retrofitting of homes is one of the key areas. Key areas you can do, and the state should fund it. It has to be funded as a key measure. And of course, the other thing that we've seen been done in terms of cost of living and the Spanish government is they've put in place a rent freeze, a freeze on rents. And you contrast that with what has our government done, actually allowed rents increase. Yeah. And allow it's the contrast between them. And it's been interesting for me to see that rents haven't even entered the discussion around the cost of living thing. That it's been
interesting, yeah.
It's just
focuses on services and things. In terms of the daily costs.
Whereas rents are a massive contribution to cost of living, and then we see the councils increasing rents as well. Dublin City Council or councils increasing rents. And at the same time, we see this huge wave of evictions going on. We haven't seen as many evictions in this country since the famine. We're seeing Galway, mass evictions, Wexford, Sligo.
Horrifying. And economic evictions as well. People who cannot afford to pay. It compared to kind of maybe other forms of evictions. It's that kind of piece of it is actually so evocative of the famine.
Yeah, absolutely.
How people are losing, their sense of safety and a place to live. I was speaking to someone recently who told me that their father, a lifelong Fine Gael voter, has watched them, this young person in their 30s, has watched them struggle so much with housing that they're actually questioning finally, the norm of Fine Gael that, for so many years has been accepted. That older generation is actually being I'm seeing my the young people in my life struggle to find safety and security. And I found that so profound, that it's watching their loved ones just face this catastrophe that is really starting to change people's minds. And I think that's, it's where I think we will see a sea change over the next few years.
I do think so. The housing issue is like affecting so many people. And, the last election, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael promised, said we were doing so well, and their numbers, they inflated the numbers.
They misled the public.
They did absolutely misled the public. They misled in terms of numbers they were going to produce. They misled it through showing this increase in commencements and then collapses the year after. And they promised they'd turn a corner, and of course, no such thing. And people are not going to believe them again. The reality is, they're continuing policies that aren't working.
Yeah.
Also, this week, I brought in a bill to put a right to housing in the Constitution, which is something that is, really, I think, fundamental to changing how we deliver.
Yeah, and there should be no
housing.
issue with it. Like the government should have no issue with that if they believe that everyone should have a home.
Yeah.
But they won't. They will prevaricate on that piece of legislation because there is no way they want to admit that actually housing is a human right and that people deserve to have someone over their head. I know you were talking about the kind of the things that the Spanish government have done, and I think the Spanish government at the moment are like a leading light in so many ways, and particularly on what, and going back a little bit to the US's illegal war, Spain has been so strong on that. They've been so strong on calling it out as a breach of international law. They've been so strong on saying like no US warplanes in Spain, and our government are not doing that.
No.
We had reporting from the ditch this week that said a US aircraft had landed carrying the kind of munitions that are used in the war in Iran, and they've landed, and there was no permission granted by the Department of Transport. That's an indictable offence. So, like, what is our government doing? Are they going to be holding anyone accountable for that?
Turning a blind eye to it, absolutely turning a blind eye. And people are so angry and frustrated over it, and really feel let down. That we're complicit. We are complicit. In this war.
They're making us participants of it. The other thing as well, I just want to shout out Leila Doolan, who's a 91-year-old activist who's going to be walking from Shannon next week to the Dáil over several weeks. And she's a political activist, peace activist, in kind of protest to what the government are doing in Shannon. They don't want us to see it, and they want us to ignore it. And it's really great that someone in her 90s is just so fed up that she's taken this action. Obviously, we know it should never come to that. But
no, it's so important. All those kind of the actions, the peace actions, they highlight. Essentially, again, the way in which policy, government is not representing people. I think that's so important. The last thing, just to finish on the Occupied Territories Bill, we mentioned it earlier. The government, what is happening with that?
I believe they just don't want to do it. I think they are trying to time it out because, we had it over 10 months now since it was discussed in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we got cross-party support for it. We had a great demo yesterday outside Leinster House from 10 until 7, organised by the Palestinian activists. And, I think they're just hoping it'll go away. I think they're hoping people will forget. There is absolutely no reason. We heard from Simon Harris last year. I think he said something like, we've got no policy objection to it. So why has it not been passed?
Why has it not been passed?
Spain have done it. Belgium have done it. The Netherlands, Slovenia.
Yeah. It's like, just prevarication. There go the lights. Just like the OTB, the Occupied Territories Bill, disappearing. No, listen, we will leave it there, and thank you so much everyone for watching and listening, and we will talk to you all very soon.
Go on.